Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to the ancient world, but to a period we often think of as enlightened and beautiful, the Renaissance. We picture grand art, stunning architecture, and brilliant minds. But beneath that veneer of beauty, the world of medicine was a truly horrifying place. You're about to discover a world where a simple headache could lead to a doctor draining your blood, where the scientific revolution was at war with ancient, flawed beliefs, and where the line between a healer and a butcher was terrifyingly thin. Imagine you're a well-dressed citizen of Florence. Maybe the year 1550. You've come down with a bad case of the flu, you're feverish and weak, and you have no concept of viruses or bacteria. You call for a doctor, a man who has studied the great texts of Hippocrates and Galen, men who had been dead for over 1,000 years. He doesn't have an antibiotic or an aspirin. He has a simple, deeply flawed idea and a sharp lancet. He'll tell you that your fever is due to an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and his cure will be to remove the excess fluid. A little reality check for you if you were to get sick in the Renaissance. You'd probably be better off just staying in bed and hoping for the best. The cure was often more likely to kill you than the disease itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're starting this journey in the very place where the Renaissance, this great rebirth of knowledge, was born. And what's truly horrifying is how little had changed in medicine. Despite the rise of brilliant artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, the medical profession was still firmly rooted in the old, ancient, and deeply wrong ideas of the past. The prevailing theory of the time was still humorism, the idea that the body was made up of four fluids, or humors, and that all illness was caused by an imbalance of these fluids. This is a foundational historical fact, and it is the key to understanding all the horrors to come. The doctor wasn't trying to fight a disease, he was trying to rebalance your internal ecosystem. And for over 1,000 years. The primary way of doing this was to literally remove the excess fluid. So, you're that Florentine citizen with the flu, and the doctor, a serious man with a neatly trimmed beard, looks at you and pronounces that you have too much blood. He decides to perform a bloodletting. This isn't just a quaint historical detail, it was a common, widely practiced, and highly respected medical procedure. He would take a sharp lancet, a small blade, and make an incision in a vein, often in your arm or neck. The blood would flow into a basin, and the doctor would watch the color and consistency of the blood, looking for signs that the humors were being rebalanced. The patient, already weak from the fever, would often become weaker, and in many cases, die. A less-known detail is that the doctor wouldn't just use a lancet, he might also use leeches, a specific type bred for this purpose. To drain the blood, the leeches were seen as a more gentle method, as they were believed to draw out only the bad blood. It's a chilling thought, a man of science calmly placing dozens of blood-sucking parasites on your skin in the name of a cure. The belief in the humors was so deeply ingrained that it influenced everything. If you were prone to anger, you had too much yellow bile. If you were melancholic, you had too much black bile. The entire medical system was built on this flawed foundation. And the doctors, the learned men of the time, were not just passively following old rules. They were actively writing new medical texts that reiterated and expanded on these ideas. There was no room for a dissenting opinion. If you were a doctor who suggested that, say, an illness was caused by something other than the humors, you'd be ridiculed and dismissed. The great thinkers of the Renaissance were exploring the stars and painting masterpieces. But when it came to the human body, they were still stuck in the Dark Ages. This brings us to a specific academic debate that still lingers. Why didn't the Renaissance? A time of intellectual curiosity and discovery. Produce a medical revolution. The historians still debate whether the deference to ancient authorities like Galen was so strong that it stifled new ideas, or if the lack of a tool like the microscope made it impossible to challenge the existing theories. It's likely a mix of both. The old ideas were so deeply entrenched, and the tools to prove them wrong simply didn't exist. So, the doctors of the time were stuck, operating under a false premise, and their patients were the ones who paid the price. Now, imagine a simple illness, like a stomachache. In the Renaissance, a doctor might diagnose you with an excess of black bile. His cure, a powerful laxative or an emetic, a substance that would make you vomit violently. The idea was to purge the body of the excess humor. These purges were often made with dangerous and toxic ingredients, and they would leave the patient severely dehydrated and even more ill than before. The doctor, seeing the patient's symptoms change, would often mistake the violent vomiting and diarrhea for a successful cleansing of the humors, completely missing the fact that they were slowly killing their patient. This is a powerful and deeply ironic truth about Renaissance medicine. The doctors were so convinced of their own theories that they would see success in a patient's suffering. As you drift off, let this image settle in your mind: a man of learning, a doctor, in a beautiful, ornate room, looking at a patient with a fever. He's surrounded by books filled with ancient wisdom. He takes out a sharp blade, and with a sense of purpose and confidence, he begins to let the blood flow. He believes with all his heart that he is saving a life. He is not a monster. He is a man of his time, and that, in its own way, is the most horrifying thing of all. The air in your quiet room is still. A world away from the blood-soaked chaos of a Renaissance doctor's office. We've just left a world where a fever could lead to a fatal bloodletting, all in the name of an ancient, flawed theory. Now, let's explore a fascinating and gruesome detail of the Renaissance medical landscape: the barber surgeon. This is a foundational historical fact, and it perfectly illustrates the blurred and often horrifying line between a respected trade and a medical professional. The barber surgeon was a man who not only gave you a haircut and a shave, but also performed surgery. He was a jack of all trades, and his shop was a hub of activity, a place where you could get a tooth pulled, a limb amputated, or a fresh haircut, often with the same set of unsterilized tools. Imagine you're a person in 16th century London, and you've developed a massive, throbbing abscess on your leg. It's painful, it's red, and it needs to be lanced. You don't go to a stately physician in a university, you go to the barber surgeon. You see his sign outside the shop, a red and white pole. The barber's pole is a less known detail, but a crucial one. The red stripe symbolized blood. The white stripe symbolized the bandages, and the pole itself symbolized the stick that a patient would grip during a bloodletting. This wasn't just a sign, it was a promise of a full-service experience. From a fresh trim to a bloody amputation, the barber surgeon's office was not a sterile, quiet place. It was likely a loud, bustling room, with the smell of blood mixing with the scent of cheap soap. He would have a variety of tools: razors for shaving, saws for amputations, and a variety of knives and forceps for other gruesome procedures. He had no concept of germs or hygiene. The instruments would be used on one patient after another, wiped clean on a dirty rag and put away for the next customer. This is a horrifying thought. The same razor that was just used to shave a man's face might be used to open a wound just minutes later. The barber surgeon's most common procedure, aside from haircutting, was bloodletting. We've already discussed the flawed theory behind this, but the barber surgeon was the one who actually carried it out. He would open a vein, often in the arm, and let the blood flow A patient might get up from a shave and a haircut, sit in the same chair, and get their blood drained. The barber surgeon would also perform a variety of other minor surgical procedures, such as lancing boils, setting bones, and pulling teeth. These were all done without anesthesia, with the patient's screams often filling the shop, a common and accepted part of the day's business. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Why did the medical profession split in two? With the learned physicians who only diagnosed and the barber surgeons who actually operated, historians still debate whether this was a class distinction. With the physicians seeing themselves as superior intellectuals and the surgeons as mere tradesmen. Or if it was a practical matter, with the physicians needing someone to perform the messy, bloody work. The truth is likely a mix of both. The physician, with his university education and knowledge of Latin, saw himself as a scholar, a man of theory. The barber surgeon was a man of action, a practical tradesman who learned his craft through apprenticeship and brute experience. The horrifying truth is that the barber surgeon's skills were often limited to what they could learn through a crude apprenticeship. They had little to no knowledge of anatomy or physiology. Their understanding of the human body was based on what they could see and feel, not on a deep, scientific knowledge. This led to a variety of disastrous and often fatal mistakes. A simple amputation, a procedure they performed often, was a high-stakes gamble, with the patient's survival depending more on luck than on skill. The lack of sterilization meant that even a successful operation often led to a deadly infection, a concept that was completely foreign to them. As you drift off, let this image settle in your mind: a busy street in London. The sign of a red and white pole hanging outside a shop. Inside, a man in a leather apron is carefully shaving a customer's beard, while in the corner, another patient is screaming in agony as a tooth is being pulled. The two scenes, the mundane and the horrifying, exist side by side, a perfect picture of the brutal reality of Renaissance medicine. It's a world that, thankfully, has been left far behind. The stillness of your room is a peaceful sanctuary, a world away from the chaotic and unhygienic shops of the barber surgeons. We've explored the brutality of their trade. Now, let's talk about a revolutionary shift in thinking that was born in the heart of the Renaissance. A shift that laid the foundation for modern medicine, but came with a dark and gruesome price. We're talking about the birth of anatomy and the black market for human bodies that it created. This is a foundational historical fact for the first time in centuries. Doctors were starting to question the old texts and to literally look inside the human body. Imagine you're an ambitious medical student in Padua, a hub of Renaissance learning. Maybe the year 1540. You've been taught that the human body works exactly as the ancient Greek physician Galen described it. A man who had based his work on the dissection of animals, not humans, but you've also heard whispers of a new way of thinking. A revolutionary approach pioneered by a man named Andreas Vesalius. Vesalius, a brilliant anatomist, was starting to question Galen's work, and he knew the only way to truly understand the human body was to see it for himself. He needed to dissect human corpses, a practice that was, at the time, highly taboo and often illegal. This is a less-known detail, but a crucial one. Vesalius's work, which culminated in his groundbreaking book De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, was a direct challenge to the medical establishment. His book, filled with stunningly detailed and accurate drawings of the human body, exposed hundreds of errors in Galen's work. The sheer intellectual audacity of this was breathtaking. He wasn't just offering a new theory, he was saying, Galen was wrong, and I have the proof. But to get that proof, he needed bodies, and that created a thriving black market for human remains. The demand for cadavers for dissection created a dark and illicit trade. Grave robbing became a common occurrence, with medical students and anatomists paying grave robbers or resurrectionists to dig up freshly buried bodies. It's a truly horrifying thought, a student. Desperate for a body to dissect. Paying a man to sneak into a cemetery under the cover of night and steal a corpse. The bodies were often sold for a high price, and the trade became so common that people started to take precautions, such as burying their loved ones in iron coffins or in guarded cemeteries. The black market for bodies was a direct result of a scientific revolution, a gruesome detail of a time of great intellectual progress. This brings us to a specific academic debate: was the rise of anatomy a purely scientific endeavor? Or was it also a kind of morbid curiosity? A fascination with the macabre. Historians still debate whether Vesalius and his peers were driven solely by a desire for knowledge, or if there was also a darker, more unsettling fascination with death and the human body. The truth is likely a mix of both. The Renaissance was a time of intense curiosity, and the human body, in all its complexity, was the ultimate mystery. The anatomists were driven to solve that mystery, and they were willing to go to great lengths to do so. The horrifying truth is that the dissections themselves were often brutal and unsanitary. The bodies were not preserved in the way we preserve them today. They would decompose quickly, and the dissections had to be done with speed. The smell would have been overpowering, and the scene would have been bloody and gruesome. The students, in their unhygienic clothes and with their unwashed hands, would have worked on the cadaver. A chilling echo of the unsanitary conditions we saw in the barber-surgeons' shops. The study of the human body, a pursuit of knowledge, was still a messy and deeply visceral affair. As you drift off, let this image settle in your mind: a dimly lit lecture hall. A crowd of medical students gathered around a table. On the table lies a human corpse, a body that was likely stolen from its grave just days before. The professor, Vesalius himself, is pointing out an error in Galen's work, a small detail that has been missed for over 1,000 years. This moment, this single act of intellectual courage, is the birth of modern medicine, but it was born in a bloody, dark, and deeply unsettling way. The quiet of your room is a peaceful sanctuary, a world away from the clandestine world of grave robbers and anatomists. We've explored the birth of anatomy and its dark side. Now, let's talk about a specific medical figure who has become a symbol of this era: the plague doctor. We're stepping into a time of immense fear and desperation, and we'll uncover the true story behind that iconic, terrifying beak. This is a foundational historical fact: the plague doctor was a real medical professional, and his bizarre costume was not just a strange aesthetic choice, but a practical, if deeply flawed, tool. Imagine you're a citizen of a European city in the 17th century, and the bubonic plague has returned. The streets are a ghost town, and the air is thick with a mixture of fear and the overpowering smell of death. You've developed the telltale black buboes, and you know you're likely to die. A figure appears at your door, a man in a long, dark coat, with a strange leather mask that has a long, bird-like beak. He is the plague doctor, and he has come to cure you. The costume is a less-known detail, but a crucial one. The mask wasn't just for show. It was a kind of primitive gas mask, a desperate attempt to protect the doctor from the miasma, the bad air, that was believed to be the cause of the plague. The beak was filled with a variety of strong-smelling herbs, such as mint and rose petals, and spices, which were believed to ward off the miasma. The glass eye holes were there to protect his eyes. The long coat, made of waxed leather, was also believed to be a protective barrier against the disease. This brings us to a specific academic debate: were the plague doctors simply charlatans? Or were they genuinely trying to help? Historians still debate whether the plague doctor's main goal was to cure the sick, or to simply record the number of plague victims for the government. The truth is likely a mix of both. They were often government employed, and their main function was to keep account of the dead. But they also offered a variety of bizarre and ineffective cures. They would often use a long stick, which they used to poke the buboes. A horrifying detail that was believed to release the poison. They would also use bloodletting and other purges. The same old, flawed remedies we've seen before. The irony is that by poking the buboes, they were likely spreading the plague even further, making the situation even worse. The horrifying truth is that the plague doctors' cures were completely ineffective. They had no understanding of bacteria or viruses. They were operating on a completely false premise, and their cures were often more dangerous than the disease itself. But in a time of such profound desperation, any form of hope, any figure who seemed to have a plan, was a welcome sight. The plague doctor, with his strange, ominous appearance, was a symbol of hope in a world of despair. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the plague doctors were not always highly trained physicians. They were often second-rate doctors, or even men who had no medical training at all, who were hired by the government to do the most dangerous and unpleasant job imaginable. They were not the best and brightest of the medical world. They were often the desperate and the opportunistic. The job was so risky that no one else would take it, and the pay was often high enough to tempt the most desperate of men. The iconic plague doctor is not a symbol of medical prowess. He's a symbol of profound desperation and the terrifying reality of a world without any real medical solutions. The silence of your room is a peaceful respite, a world away from the terrifying streets of a plague-ridden city. We've unmasked the iconic plague doctor, revealing the flawed logic and desperate measures behind his eerie costume. Now, let's explore a new kind of horror, one that swept across Europe and forever changed the course of medical history: the syphilis scourge and the deadly, toxic cure that followed. This is a foundational historical fact. The Renaissance saw the arrival of a devastating new disease, and the medical world's response was a brutal and, in many cases, lethal treatment. Imagine you're a person in the late 15th century, and you've contracted a mysterious new illness. It starts with a small sore, but soon progresses to a terrifying rash, fever, and a variety of other devastating symptoms. This disease, which became known as syphilis, was a complete mystery to the doctors of the time. They had never seen anything like it. It was a pandemic, a terrifying new illness that spread like wildfire across Europe, and the doctors, still operating under the humoral theory, had no idea how to treat it. This is a key detail. Syphilis was so new and so devastating that it completely upended the old medical beliefs, forcing doctors to look for new solutions. Even if those solutions were incredibly dangerous, the most common and widely accepted cure for syphilis was mercury. This wasn't some back alley remedy, it was a mainstream medical treatment. Patients would be given mercury in a variety of forms. They would be given pills to swallow. They would have mercury mixed into an ointment that would be rubbed on their skin. And they would even be forced to sit in a heated room where mercury vapors would be inhaled. The horrifying truth is that mercury is a heavy, toxic metal that causes a variety of terrible side effects, including severe neurological damage, tooth loss, and muscle paralysis. The patient would suffer from these side effects, and the doctors, seeing the symptoms of mercury poisoning, would often mistake them for a successful cleansing of the illness. The patient would go mad, their teeth would fall out, and their body would be racked with pain. And the doctor would nod sagely and pronounce the treatment a success. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Did the doctors of the time truly believe that mercury was a cure? Or were they just desperate for any solution? Historians still debate whether mercury actually had any effect on the syphilis bacteria. Some historians argue that the temporary remission of symptoms, a natural part of the disease's progression, was mistaken for a cure. Others argue that mercury may have had some antimicrobial properties that, in high doses, could have killed some of the bacteria. Regardless of the truth, the suffering it caused was immense, and the cure was often worse than the disease itself. A less known but equally horrifying detail is that syphilis was often seen as a punishment for sin. The disease, which was spread through sexual contact, was seen as a divine retribution for a person's moral failings. This led to a profound sense of shame and social ostracism for those who contracted it. They were not just sick, they were seen as morally corrupt, and the brutal mercury cure, with all its suffering and disfigurement, was often seen as a kind of penance, a physical punishment for a moral transgression. This added a layer of profound psychological horror to the disease, making the patient not just a victim of an illness, but a pariah of society as you drift off. Let this image settle in your mind. A patient, their body covered in a mercury-based ointment, their teeth loose, their mind a fog of confusion and pain. They are not just suffering from a disease, they are suffering from the cure. A brutal and ineffective treatment that was born from a combination of ignorance, desperation, and moral judgment. It's a powerful and sobering thought that a disease could be so terrifying that people were willing to endure such a horrific cure. The quiet hum of your fan is a steady companion as we leave the devastating world of syphilis and its toxic mercury cure. We've seen how desperation can lead people to endure unimaginable suffering in the name of a cure. Now, let's explore the other side of Renaissance medicine, the one that was practiced not by learned doctors, but by the apothecaries and alchemists who sold their concoctions to the public. This is a foundational historical fact. The early pharmacist was not just a dispenser of medicine, but a creator of mysterious and often poisonous potions. Imagine you're a person in a busy Renaissance town, and you have a nagging headache. You don't have a doctor, and you don't have a pharmacy as we know it today. Instead, you go to an apothecary's shop. The shop would be a strange and wonderful place, filled with jars of herbs, tinctures, and strange powders. The air would be filled with a mix of sweet and pungent smells. The apothecary, a man who was part pharmacist, part botanist, and part showman, would listen to your symptoms and then, with a great sense of ceremony, begin to mix a potion for you. A less-known detail is that the apothecary was often seen as a kind of folk hero, a man who was more accessible and often more trusted than the learned physicians who only spoke in Latin and prescribed bloodletting. The horrifying truth is that the ingredients in these potions were often deadly. The line between a cure and a poison was incredibly thin, and the apothecary often didn't know the difference. Many of their concoctions were based on old, flawed recipes that had been passed down for centuries. They would use a variety of toxic plants, such as belladonna and foxglove, which, in the right doses, could be used as a painkiller or a heart stimulant, but in the wrong doses, were deadly poisons. The apothecary, with no real understanding of chemical properties or dosages, was essentially playing a game of chance with their patients' lives. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Were the apothecaries simply reckless? Or were they operating with the best knowledge available to them? Historians still debate whether they were just trying to make a quick buck, or if they genuinely believed in the efficacy of their potions. The truth is likely a mix of both. They were a commercial enterprise, and they had to sell products to survive, but they also had a genuine desire to help people, and they were operating in a time of profound medical ignorance. They were using the tools they had, and those tools were often dangerous and unpredictable. The apothecary's shop was also a place where alchemists would work. The alchemist was a man who was part scientist, part mystic, and part charlatan. He would spend his days in a lab filled with strange bubbling beakers and steaming retorts, trying to turn lead into gold, and in the process, he would often create a variety of new and strange concoctions. These concoctions were often sold to the public as a kind of miracle cure, an elixir of life that promised to cure all a person's ills. The horrifying detail is that many of these concoctions contained heavy metals like lead and mercury, which the alchemist in his ignorance believed to be the key to a long and healthy life. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the apothecary's potions often contained a significant amount of alcohol, a fact that was not advertised. The patient, feeling the intoxicating effects of the alcohol, would often feel a temporary relief from their symptoms, mistaking the numbing of their pain for a genuine cure. The apothecary, seeing the patient's positive response, would be convinced that their potion had worked. It was a vicious cycle of ignorance and misinterpretation. With the patient's suffering only being masked, not cured, the air in your quiet room is still, a world away from the pungent smells and mysterious potions of the apothecary. We've seen how the line between a cure and a poison was terrifyingly thin. Now, let's explore a particularly dark and often misunderstood chapter in the history of medicine, the intersection of women, healing, and the terrifying era of the witch hunts. This is a foundational historical fact for a long time. The woman who practiced folk medicine was seen not as a healer, but as a potential witch. And her knowledge was seen not as a gift, but as a dangerous and malevolent power. Imagine you're a woman in a small village in the 16th century, and you've learned the art of healing from your mother and grandmother. You know which herbs can ease a fever, which plants can soothe a burn, and which concoctions can help a woman through childbirth. You are a cunning woman, a wise woman, and you are the primary source of medical care for your community. You don't have a medical degree or a license. You have a deep, practical knowledge of the natural world. Your knowledge is a crucial and less known detail for centuries. Women were the primary practitioners of medicine in their communities. Using a variety of herbs and folk remedies, the horrifying truth is that this knowledge, and the women who held it, became a target during the witch hunts. The line between a healer and a witch was terrifyingly thin, and a woman who could cure an illness was often seen as a woman who could also cause it. A woman who helped a baby survive a difficult birth might be praised. But if the baby died, she might be accused of witchcraft. The doctor, a learned man with a university education, might be respected for his knowledge of Latin and his adherence to the humoral theory, even if his cures were ineffective. The cunning woman, with her practical knowledge of herbs, was often seen as a threat, a practitioner of a dangerous, supernatural art. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Was the witch hunt a deliberate attempt by the male medical establishment to eliminate competition? Or was it a genuine, if misguided? Fear of the supernatural historians still debate whether the doctors of the time, the men who only prescribed bloodletting, saw the women healers as a direct threat to their authority and income. It's likely a mix of both. The women healers were a direct challenge to the authority of the male physicians. They were successful, they were respected, and they offered a kind of care that was often more effective than the physicians. The witch hunts provided a convenient and deadly way to eliminate this competition. The horrifying detail is that the cures used to identify a witch were often more terrifying than the accusation itself. A woman accused of witchcraft might be subjected to a variety of tortures, such as the dunking test, where she would be thrown into a body of water. If she sank and drowned, she was innocent. If she floated, she was a witch, and she would be burned at the stake. This was a no-win situation, a brutal and illogical system designed to eliminate women who were seen as a threat. The use of torture and the belief in the supernatural meant that there was no way for an accused woman to prove her innocence. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the knowledge of these women healers was often lost. With the death of these cunning women, their knowledge of herbs and folk remedies was lost to the world. This created a void, a lack of practical medical knowledge that was not filled by the learned, but often ineffective. Male physicians. The witch hunts were not just a tragedy for the women who were killed, they were a tragedy for the history of medicine itself. The stillness of your room is a peaceful sanctuary, a world away from the terrifying fires of the witch hunts. We've seen how female healers, with their deep knowledge of the natural world, were persecuted and how their knowledge was tragically lost. Now, let's explore a more hopeful, but still deeply unsettling chapter of Renaissance medicine, the slow and painful shift from ancient dogma to empirical observation. This is a foundational historical fact. The Renaissance was the time when a new way of thinking, the scientific method, began to take hold, but it was a long and difficult battle against the weight of tradition. Imagine you're a young doctor in the 17th century, and you've just come from a university lecture where you were taught that the human body works exactly as Galen described it. But you've also read the groundbreaking work of Vesalius, and you've seen with your own eyes that Galen was wrong. You're a man named William Harvey, and you're about to make one of the most important discoveries in the history of medicine. Harvey, a brilliant English physician, was obsessed with a single question: how does blood move through the body? The old belief, handed down from Galen, was that blood was created in the liver, pumped out by the heart, and then consumed by the body's tissues in a one-way street. Harvey, with his own dissections and careful observation, began to question this. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Was Harvey's discovery a sudden, revolutionary insight, or was it the culmination of a slow, gradual shift in thinking? Historians still debate whether Harvey was a lone genius or a man who was simply building on the work of others. The truth is, his discovery was a revolutionary act, a direct challenge to the authority of Galen. His work, which culminated in his 1628 book De Motu Cordis on the Motion of the Heart, laid out the theory of blood circulation. He argued that the heart was a pump, and that blood was not consumed, but circulated in a closed loop. A less-known detail is that Harvey's discovery was met with fierce resistance. The old guard of medicine, the men who had built their careers on Galen's teachings, refused to believe him. They called his ideas absurd, and his career suffered for it. The horrifying truth is that the old ideas were incredibly hard to kill. The scientific method, the idea that you should observe, hypothesize, and test, was a new and unsettling way of thinking. The doctors of the time were more comfortable with the old, established truths, even if those truths were demonstrably false. The rise of the scientific method was a slow and painful process, a battle fought by a few brave men against the stubborn resistance of an entire profession. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the scientific method didn't immediately lead to a better quality of life for the patient. Even with Harvey's discovery, doctors still didn't understand germs or infection. They still performed bloodletting and purges, and their cures were still often more dangerous than the disease. The scientific method was a powerful new tool, but it would take centuries for it to produce real, tangible results. The Renaissance laid the foundation for modern medicine, but it was a long and bloody road from that foundation to the world we live in today. The quiet of your room is a peaceful sanctuary, a world away from the intellectual battles of the Renaissance. We've seen how the scientific method was born, a slow and painful birth, but a necessary one. Now, let's go back to the most visceral and terrifying part of Renaissance medicine: surgery, even with new anatomical knowledge. The reality of an operation was still a nightmare of unimaginable pain and high stakes. This is a foundational historical fact for a long time. The only way to perform surgery was with brute force, unsterile tools, and without any effective painkiller. Imagine you're a person in 17th century London, and you've developed a massive tumor on your leg. It's painful and growing, and you know you have to have it removed. You go to a surgeon, a man who is often a member of the barber-surgeon guild. There is no such thing as an operating room, and the procedure is likely to be performed in the surgeon's shop. On a simple wooden table, he has a variety of tools, a set of knives and saws, but he has no concept of sterilization. The tools are likely covered in the grime and blood of the last patient. He hands you a shot of whiskey, a leather strap to bite down on, and a few strong men to hold you still. The horrifying truth is that the surgery itself was a race against time. The surgeon, knowing that the patient was in unimaginable pain, would work with a frantic speed. The best surgeons were the fastest. A less known detail is that the surgeon would often be judged by how quickly he could perform an amputation. The faster the amputation, the less time the patient would be in screaming agony, and the less likely they were to die from the shock of the pain. The screams of the patient, the sound of the saw on the bone, the sight of the blood. This was the brutal reality of an operation. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Did the Renaissance surgeons have any effective form of pain relief? Historians still debate whether there were any effective painkillers available to the surgeons. They had access to opium and a variety of other herbs. But these were often crude and ineffective. They would often just make the patient groggy and slightly less aware. Not unconscious. The patient would feel every single cut, every single saw, and every single stitch. The experience would be so traumatic that many patients simply died from the shock of the pain alone. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that even if the patient survived the operation, they were far from safe. The greatest danger was still to come: infection, with no concept of germs. The wound would be left open to the elements, and the bandages would be a source of infection. The patient would often develop a fever. The wound would fester, and within a few days, they would be dead. The surgery, a procedure that was meant to save a life, was often the direct cause of death. The irony is that the surgeon, in his ignorance, was often the one who introduced the deadly infection, a concept that was completely foreign to him. The quiet of your room is a peaceful sanctuary, a world away from the blood-soaked operating tables of the Renaissance. We've seen the brute force of surgery and the high price of a new idea. Now, for our final chapter, let's bring it all together. We'll connect the strange, terrifying past of Renaissance medicine to our modern world, examining how the foundations of our modern understanding were laid in this era of both brilliant minds and horrifying practices. This is a crucial final point. The Renaissance was a time of immense intellectual growth, but it was also a time of profound medical ignorance. And the legacy of both is still with us. Think back to Vesalius, that brave anatomist who dared to challenge the authority of Galen. His work, and the work of men like William Harvey, laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of the human body. The idea that a doctor should look for himself, that he should trust his own eyes over the words of a long-dead authority, is the very foundation of the scientific method in medicine. This is a foundational truth our modern world, with its MRI machines and its genetic sequencing, is a direct result of that initial act of intellectual rebellion. But the Renaissance also gave us a different kind of legacy, a legacy of quackery and mysticism. Remember the apothecaries and alchemists, those men who sold their mysterious potions and poisonous concoctions? This kind of rhetoric is still with us today, in the form of supplement companies and wellness gurus who promise a secret or a natural cure that the medical establishment is hiding from you. They often use the same kind of language, promising a sense of personal control over your own health. The horrifying detail is that many of these products are unregulated, untested, and can be actively harmful. The alchemist hasn't gone away, he's just learned how to use a website. This brings us to a specific academic debate. Did the Renaissance create the foundations of both modern medicine and modern pseudoscience? Historians still debate whether the chaos and lack of regulation in Renaissance medicine, the blurred line between a physician and an apothecary, created a kind of free-for-all that allowed charlatans to thrive. The truth is, the Renaissance, with its new ideas and its old beliefs, was a breeding ground for both. It was a time of immense intellectual growth, but it was also a time of immense fear and ignorance. And that fear and ignorance created a market for anything that promised a simple solution. The final piece of this puzzle is the fact that the Renaissance, with all its horrors, was a necessary step. It was a bloody, brutal, and often misguided era. But it was the era in which the first brave steps were taken. It was the era in which a few courageous men dared to question the old, established truths, and that act of courage. That single act of intellectual rebellion is what led to the world we live in today. A world where a trip to the doctor is an expectation of healing, not a roll of the dice. It's time to dim the lights, to let the images of barber-surgeons, plague doctors, and mercury cures fade into the background. The past is a quiet place now, a story told in the darkness, but its lessons are still with us. A gentle warning that the path to knowledge is long and winding, and the simplest cures are often the most dangerous. The quiet of your room feels safe and secure, a place of peace in a world that, for most of human history, was anything but let the hum of the fan and the darkness wash over you, and let the stories of the past settle into a soft, distant memory. There's no need for bloodletting or mercury cures tonight, just the gentle quiet and a well-earned rest. You're safe now. Good night.